Bonjour tout le monde. Ça me fait plaisir de vous accueillir à cette conférence de l'Observatoire Ivanhoé Cambridge. La conférence est hybride, donc on est dans une salle de l'Université de Montréal à la Faculté de l'aménagement, mais on est aussi avec vous sur Internet, donc j'espère que techniquement ça va bien se passer. Ça me fait plaisir d'accueillir les chercheurs et les profs qui vont vous présenter cette conférence-ci, en raison notamment que c'est issu d'un projet qui a été financé par l'Observatoire sur la question des infrastructures vertes et bleues. Donc, pour suivre aussi les travaux de ces projets-là, je vous invite aussi à aller sur notre site web, voir les rapports de recherche, voir les notes de recherche qui sont publiées. Et je vais tout de suite vous passer la parole à Danielle Dagenais, qui est responsable du grand projet duquel la présentation d'aujourd'hui, la conférence d'aujourd'hui est issue. Et elle va vous parler en quelques mots avant de laisser la parole à notre invité. Donc, Danielle, je te laisse la parole.
Parfait. Alors, je veux aussi vous souhaiter la bienvenue au nom de l'École d'urbanisme et d'architecture de paysage, dont je suis la directrice et qui accueille Martijn Kuller, notre conférencier, comme chercheur invité. Je veux aussi peut-être préciser que le projet dont parle Sébastien est un projet qui est menée par Françoise Bichaille, qui est une collègue à l'École polytechnique et aussi des collègues de l'Université Laval et d'autres collègues de l'IAWAG, c'est-à-dire l'Institut fédéral suisse de la recherche, des sciences et des technologies de l'eau. Donc, notre conférencier aujourd'hui est Martijn Kuller, PhD, qui est chercheur justement à cet institut et qui est aussi récipiendaire de la bourse postdoctorale mondiale Marie Curie, une bourse extrêmement prestigieuse, et qui va vous présenter les résultats de ses recherches et de ses questionnements sur des outils d'aide à la décision pour l'implantation des infrastructures vertes en milieu urbain. Donc, je passe la parole à Martijn. Oh, yeah. In case of you speak English, and of course our conference is going to be in English, while Martijn Kuller is a researcher at the IAWAG, the Swiss Federal Institute on Science and Water Technology. I'm not sure if I translate it right. He also received a Marie Curie Global Research Fellowship, which is a very prestigious scholarship. He received that last year, I guess, which allowed him to come to Quebec and work with our team at University of Montreal, École Polytechnique, and with Université Laval. So I'm going to let Martijn present his conference. Thank you for being with us.
So thank you, Sebastian and Danielle, and hi everyone. Thanks for the introduction. So I'm Martijn Kuller, and I'm going to talk to you about how to make blue-green infrastructure work in our cities. What are the questions and how to answer these questions? So let me take you back. I have to point it that way. Oh, now it's not working anymore. It worked just now. No, don't know what happened there. I'll just do it like this. Or maybe I have to select it. Yes, okay, there we go. Let me take you back about 15 years. When I was a bachelor student at the University of Wageningen in the Netherlands. And we were on an excursion for a course. I was studying urban environmental management. And we were taken on an excursion to Rotterdam to this big green roof, which is called the Dakpark, which at the time and still now is one of the biggest green roofs in Europe. And they were, at the time, they were still building it. And we could see it from a distance. We couldn't actually go on top. And I remember thinking, well, this looks like a very nice gimmick. It looks very cool. But I didn't think much of it in terms of what it would really mean and how much it could benefit the city. Actually, I thought it was mostly a gimmick. Little did I know that in the next 15 years, this would be the thing that I would be working on. So with a few detours in my master, I finally ended up doing a PhD in this beautiful city here. This is one of my favorite pictures that I like to show. So what you see here is Albert Park Lake. It's in close to the city center of Melbourne. And this is actually where the Formula One is being held. So around the lake, the Formula One race cars go every year. And I used to live quite nearby, so I would always hear them. This is where I did my PhD at the University of Monash with Professor Anna Deletic. And I worked at the Institute, the Monash Sustainable Development Institute. That was chaired at the time by Professor Rebecca Brown. You might have heard of her name. So this is where I did my PhD, and I did my PhD also on the implementation of green infrastructure in the global south, specifically Asia. So I was part of a big program with a lot of PhD students looking at urban water issues in Asian countries. I looked at Indonesia myself, and this is a picture that I took in Bogor, a city that I was working with. And this is in the middle of the city, actually. It's a big park. It's a big botanical garden. And during the pandemic, sometimes I was thinking back of this little spot here. I was like, this would be an excellent place to actually do home office from, except it was full of mosquitoes. Then I went to Sydney to do a postdoc at the University of New South Wales at the Water Research Centre there. This is a picture of a building in Sydney called Central Park 1. As you can see, it's a fully green facade building. I think it looks really cool. This is in the city centre of Sydney. And this is where I used to go for my weekend on cycling tours. This is an urban wetland close to the Sydney Olympic Park. And behind this sign of identify our water birds, you can actually see my bike. I parked it there. And this is where I have my office in Zurich in Switzerland now, working at EWAG, the Swiss Federal Institute of Water Science and Technology. This is the view from my office, actually. So when I look down, I see these parkings with infiltration, like permeable pavements. And if I look up, I see the building in front of me that has a big green roof. And the building that I'm in actually also has a big green roof. Oops. This is the top of my building. I asked last week, I asked a colleague and friend, Alice Aubert, to take a picture for me of the roof at the moment. And this is what it looks like. It looks pretty dead at the moment, start of summer. Hopefully it'll become green again soon. And this is where I go. This is right in front of my office. Is where I go to sit down when I have to think about a complicated problem and I want some quiet and nature. This is right in front of the building where they have the Griesbach River, which they fully renaturalized. So the riverbeds are fully renaturalized, and it's actually a really lovely place to sit. And there's now a lot of fish in the river again as well. So I just want to thank some people that I'm collaborating with at the moment for my project. So I work at the decision analysis group of Judith Lienert on the right bottom corner of the slide here, with Peter van Rollichem at the Université Laval, professor there in the civil engineering department. And of course, Danielle, who already just spoke to you here at the Université de Montréal, and also Françoise Bichai, who Danielle mentioned as well. at Polytechnique, just uphill from here. And yeah, this my project is funded by the European Union. So the scholarship I got, the grant I got is a European Commission grant. So let me just show you some more pretty pictures of green infrastructure. So here is, this is a rooftop garden in a very densely populated area of Singapore. And this is a rooftop garden in a slightly less densely populated residential area in a fjord in Norway. These are two green facades. So on the left, we have a plant creeping up a building in Ghent, in Belgium. And on the right side, you see a city that many of you might recognize. This is a green facade in Paris, in the city center of Paris. Back to Singapore. Singapore is very well known to be an advanced city in terms of greenery and water infrastructure. This is a view on a park in Singapore that is very famous. And you can see how green the city looks. This is in the city center, the Marina Bay area of Singapore, where they've really made huge improvements in water quality over the previous years. And now they actually reintroduced a lot of animals in this bay area, which is in the middle of the city. But there's a little family of otters that actually return to the bay area because now the water is so clean. This is El Bosco Verticale in Milan. So these are two skyscrapers in a central district in Milan, where they have fully covered them in trees. And for the Canadians here, I also show a picture of what it looks like in winter. It looks pretty magical. This is a picture I took in Kuala Lumpur, close to the central station of Kuala Lumpur. There's a big park with a pond where a lot of people go in their lunch break to eat lunch and meet with friends. This is where up until recently I lived in Zurich. So the building on the right is a bike shed with a green roof where my bike is actually stored. And some more pictures from Zurich. This is a pond close to a new developed area behind it, where they take all the rainwater that falls in this area and they guide it to this pond where it gets treated by the plants you see in the front. And it's actually so clean that people swim in it in summer if it's warm enough. This is also around my place where I live in Zurich. This is a retention basin. It's actually deeper. You can't really see it on this picture, but it's deeper than the surrounding paved area. So all the water flows into the retention basin, and then it slowly infiltrates. So I've shown you a lot of pictures now of green infrastructure around the world, I mean, I think it looks really cool, but there's also another reason why I'm showing you all these pictures, not just because I think they look cool. When I went to Canada, I was going to look at the implementation of green infrastructure in a different climatic system that I'm used to, having studied mostly in Australia, where there is a lot of drought and dry weather and hot weather. And I'm used to this very lush infrastructure, green infrastructure. You can imagine how surprised I was when I first arrived mid-January in Montreal and I saw this. So no green infrastructure to be seen. It was all white infrastructure. Then when I went to Quebec, this is what it looks from the ground level, and all you Canadians, you probably are very familiar with this. So there's all these heaps of snow everywhere where snow gets moved from the street. And then there's, I arrived here close to, or just before Carnaval, and there's also this kind of white infrastructure in Quebec City during Carnaval. So this is all green, blue, and a bit of white infrastructure. And now I'm going to show you a bit of gray infrastructure. So what we normally do in cities is not what I've been showing you until now. So this is what it normally looks like. So there's these are two stormwater drains. One of them is in Melbourne and one of them is in Madrid. These are the drain inlets. One of these ones is in Quebec City and the other one is in Zurich. And as you will notice, this looks very different from the green infrastructure, and this could essentially be everywhere. If I asked you which one is Zurich and which one is Quebec, I guess I would get a 50-50 division between you. So there's some important differences. So this is what traditionally our gray infrastructure looks like. We have either a combined sewer or a separate sewer. In this picture, I show you a combined sewer where water from the house and water from the street come together. And the only thing you essentially see is this little drain inlet on the street. The rest is hidden from view underground. Now, when we move to green infrastructure, it becomes much more visible because, well, the roof now changed to green. So the person living in this house will definitely know that it's there. And they will also know that there's now a rain garden in front of their car. This might be even in their backyard. And they might have given up their parking place in order for this rain garden to be placed there. These rain gardens can still be connected to the sewer, or they can be disconnected. And so there are very important differences between these two types of systems. So the first one, the traditional gray infrastructure, is out of sight, out of mind. People usually don't even realize that it's there until it stops working, until you get like nasty odors from your toilet or from the sewer in the street. And it's mostly managed by engineers and people that work in the municipality and capital works. There's not many other people involved in the design and management of these systems. Now with green infrastructure, it's very different because it is a part of the urban landscape. Everyone can see the green roofs, everyone can see the urban wetlands, and they really need to be integrated in our cities. They're not one size fits all. They're different everywhere in the world. And you can't just implement the same thing everywhere. And that means also that it's not just engineers and capital works, still they are involved in the building of these systems, but it's now also urban planners, park services to do the maintenance of these green infrastructure, but also people like you and me, businesses and residents, because you might get a green roof on your house or office building, or you might get a rain garden in your garden. So it used to be very easy, simple questions, how to get water out of our cities as quickly and safely as possible with the gray infrastructure. Now with the green infrastructure, it becomes a lot more complex. And there's a lot of questions that we need to answer. And I'm, in this presentation, going to take you through some of those questions and how we can answer them, maybe. So the first question that's always on everyone's mind is, how do we minimize costs? On this picture here, you see a busy shopping street in Arnhem, a city in the east of the Netherlands, where they have broken up the road to do some work on the sewer. And now this is quite expensive to do because it's a busy shopping street. It's a lot of nuisance. You have to close up the street. So what happens often is that when we want to implement green infrastructure, we take the opportunity of this kind of moments to implement green infrastructure because we don't have to open up the streets twice. Other things that influence costs are, for example, slope, because we know that highly sloped areas are more expensive to implement green infrastructure like a rain garden in, because we have to do a lot more groundworks. So that could be an indicator of cost. And also the land value, we have to acquire the land in order to put something in there. And these kind of indicators, we can all put them into maps. So on the right side of this slide, you can see a map of slope, which is one of the indicators for costs. Then another question, how to integrate in the urban landscape. So because these systems are a part of the urban landscape, we need to find a place for them. So this is again the same picture that I showed you before of the view of my office. So green roof, you can implement it on many types of flat roofs and sometimes also tilted roofs. Impervious pavement is very suitable to implement in parking lots, as you can see here. And we can also capture this kind of information in maps again. So on the right side, you see the same case study area. This is actually an area in Melbourne with all the building footprints. So these are all buildings that have flat roofs that we may be able to implement green roofs on. Then how do we optimize system performance? So this is a picture that a former colleague and good friend, Natalie Barron, sent me last week from Melbourne, from a rain garden in Melbourne. And as you can see, this doesn't look very appealing. So this is a rain garden that is clogged. The water is not infiltrating as it should be. And there could be several reasons for that. A reason could be, for example, that the soil is too compacted because people walk in them. And this can lead to this kind of clogging. So if people are not aware of what a rain garden is and how to interact with it appropriately, these are things that might happen. So then a way that we can spatially represent that kind of information is, for example, by looking at environmental awareness to sort of have an estimate of how much people will accept these kind of systems in their neighborhood. And this is what the map on the right shows. So the things, the questions that I showed you until now are questions that are related to what I call the opportunities side of spatial suitability. So opportunities, because we can find locations where we can put these kind of systems. We can split that up into 3 subcategories. So we have the biophysical questions or objectives or factors related to, for example, the slope that I showed you before, but also soil type, the hydrological system, these kind of aspects. The socioeconomic factors, like this environmental awareness that I was talking about before, for example. And we've got the planning and governance type of questions, such as ownership of the land, zoning plans, the availability of land. So this is the opportunity side of the medal. The medal also has another side, which is the need side, which refers to those locations where we need all the extra benefits that we can get from these green systems. And this is these are some of the questions that I'm going to talk about now. So this is a picture that a friend from Sydney sent me from the floods that happened, I think it's now 2 weeks ago. So there were very severe floods in Sydney. In some of the suburbs, people were actually lost their houses. They were completely washed away. This is in the central part of Sydney where it wasn't quite as bad. But you can still see that there's a lot of water on the streets and the soil was completely saturated. But we know that these green systems can be very effective at mitigating especially medium-sized floods. So how do we plan for flood prevention using these kind of systems? Now, again, we can capture this kind of information on maps. So on the right, you see, again, the same study area. And this is a map of flood extents. So these are the areas that flood in, I think it's a 1 in 20 year flood event. Then the flip side of that medal is droughts. So more and more with the climate change, we see that the rain becomes more intense, but it also stays away for longer. I know in Europe at the moment there has been barely any rain for the past month, which is uncharacteristic for springtime, and that leads to urban areas looking like this one. So dried grass. And we also know that we can use some blue-green infrastructure to mitigate some of the impacts of droughts. We can capture some of the rain when it falls and reuse it when we have less. With rain tanks, for example, but some wetlands and rain gardens can also be used for this purpose. On the right side, you see a map, again, of the same area, of the green areas in the city that require irrigation in dry periods. So when we plan for these systems, we need to take into consideration this kind of information. Then one of the questions that is most important in Australia, where I did my PhD, is how do we protect water quality? So what happens in Australia is that we have a separated sewer system, one for sewage and one for stormwater. And the stormwater gets directly released into natural waterways. And this brings a lot of problems because there's a lot of nutrients dissolved in this water and also other pollutants like heavy metals. And we know that green infrastructure can help us with actually treating this water before we release it into the natural waterways. So on the right, we see a map of directly connected impervious areas. So these are the areas where the water directly flows from the street into the natural waterways. And what we want to do is use green infrastructure to reduce this amount of directly connected impervious area. Yeah, on the left, you see a picture that Natalie again sent me of a rain garden that is fully overgrown with algae because the pollutant load was too high and the system couldn't cope with it. How do we mitigate urban heat? Now, this is also becoming more and more important question with climate change and the increase of heat waves. And we know that the more gray areas we have in our cities, the stronger the what we call urban heat island effect becomes. So it's the trapping of heat in the city. And we know that if we change those gray areas to green areas, we can actually lower the temperature significantly. So where do we need to put these systems in order to benefit from this effect the most? Now, on the right, we see a map where that represents an index for the vulnerability to urban heat. So it's a combination of the exposure, so how hot does it get, and the vulnerability of the people that live there. So we know, for example, that elderly people are more vulnerable to heat waves. Then how do we support biodiversity? So another thing that we know that we can benefit from with green infrastructure is that we can enhance or protect biodiversity in our cities. And cities are actually more biodiverse than you might think. So on the right, you see a map of Zurich. This is the work that a colleague of mine, Peter Bach, is doing. So what they're doing is they're trying to map the migration routes of a specific type of frog that is endangered. And they are trying to make these maps here to identify hotspots where we should be protecting them. And now this can be used then to decide, okay, well, here we would benefit a lot in terms of biodiversity from implementing green infrastructure. And then how do we increase amenity? So some of these green infrastructures can be very nice to use for recreation. Like I was saying in the beginning, the wetland in Sydney where I used to go cycling. The green facade here in Paris is in a very busy restaurant and shopping district, which means that a lot of people get exposed to this green infrastructure and benefit from it. So if we want to increase amenity, we also need to think about where we put them in places where as many people as possible can benefit from them. And finally, there is a question of equity. So this is research that I did in Sydney a couple of years ago, where we mapped the systems in the southern region of Sydney called Georges River Catchment. And so we looked at where do we find the systems. And on the middle picture there, you can see all the suburbs in that area. And per suburb, the color indicates how much green infrastructure is there. And as you can see, there are like a few suburbs on the left that are green or yellow with a lot of green infrastructure, but most suburbs are quite red with very little green infrastructure. So it's definitely not equitably distributed in the city. And this has direct effects for the people living there, because this picture that is from Sydney again, from the last floods there, it was actually quite striking. A colleague of me told me, who lives there, to see that in the areas where there was quite a lot of greenery and green infrastructure, the flooding was much less severe than in often poorer areas that had less greening. So these kind of questions all relate to the second side of suitability that I was talking about earlier, the need side. And we can subdivide this side into 4 categories that relate to the ecosystem services framework that was adopted by the United Nations, which are provisioning. In the case of green infrastructure, is mostly provisioning of fresh water that we can use for irrigation, as I was talking about before. Then regulating. This is maybe the most important one. So it's regulating of the climate, so the local climate, heat mitigation, but it's also regulating of natural hazards, so floods. And it's also pollution control that also falls in this category. Then we have cultural aspects. So this refers to the recreation and the amenity values that we can get from green infrastructure. And the habitat, which refers to the biodiversity gains. Now, this is the suitability framework as I've developed it during my PhD, but there are still also some questions that are left to be answered. For example, an important one is, how do we capture commercial benefits? Now, there was a research done in Sydney, published in 2015 here, where they looked at rain gardens, 41 different rain gardens at intersections in the inner city area. So this is a map of the inner city area of Sydney. On the top there, you can see, yeah, I can't. Can you see my pointer? No, you can't. Okay. Well, on the top is the Sydney Opera House and the Harbour Bridge. And what they did is they looked at the house prices of houses that were being sold just after the implementation of a rain garden, and compared them to house prices before. And so what they found is that houses that were within 50 meters of a rain garden increased 6% in value, and houses that were in a 100-meter radius increased 4% in value on average. Now that might not sound as a lot, but if you consider that houses in Sydney are ridiculously expensive. I think the average house price is around 3 million. And there are a lot of houses in the vicinity of these rain gardens. Then you can imagine that per rain garden, the amount of money gained by private parties, in this case, the owners of houses, was very high. And it was 1.5 million Australian dollars per rain garden, which was actually way more than the cost of building this rain garden. So this means that there are actually commercial benefits to be gotten from these rain gardens, for example, in this example, which is very interesting, I think, for the commercial developers who are thinking about creating real estate, because they might actually gain financial benefits from implementing green infrastructure. Now, there are some questions that I didn't consider when looking in Australia at this problem. For example, the snow that I was talking about, and when it starts melting in spring and it brings all the pollution that has been building up over the winter and it all washes down all at once, including salt, for example, to de-ice the streets. So I wanted to include all of this information in the framework, and I'm supervising a student here, Sandrine Lacroix, a PhD student who is working with me to do this, to complete the framework for the Quebec situation. All right, so I've walked you through all the questions that we need to consider when we think about planning green infrastructure. Now I'm gonna show you a little bit about how we are performing at the moment. How are we actually currently planning green infrastructure, and how strategic are we about that? So this is research I did in Melbourne, where we mapped all the green infrastructure in Melbourne, which is a city with a lot of green infrastructure. And yeah, you can see the map here. Every little green spot is a system. And there are different types. So the circles you see represent the average size of the different systems. So the wetlands are the biggest systems. Then you've got the ponds and lakes, the swales, rain gardens, and other systems. And on the very right, you can see some summary statistics. So we have in total a bit more than 2,000 systems in Melbourne at the time of this study. And the total land uptake was about 1,000 hectares. The systems are in number more or less divided between wetlands, rain gardens, and ponds and lakes. But in terms of their size, it's dominated by wetlands because they're much bigger systems. And then what we looked at is, so how are these systems distributed in terms of different socio-political factors, socioeconomic factors. And what we found, actually, to our surprise, is that there's a very strong correlation between the locations of these systems and these socioeconomic indicators. So then we started looking into more depth of why this might be the case. And what we did is we divided Melbourne into circles, depending on the distance to the city center. So on this map here, you can see the city center of Melbourne in the middle, which is in dark red. And then around it in orange, you have the inner suburbs, middle suburbs in yellow, and in blue, you have the outer suburbs and the fringe areas. And then on the little box plot chart on the left, you can see these same circles, distances to the city center on the x-axis, the horizontal axis. So on the leftmost box plot, you have the inner city, and then as you move to the right, you go further away from the city center. And on the y-axis, you have the amount, let's say, of green infrastructure that we find in these areas. And so what we see is that the further away from the city center you go, the more of these green infrastructures you find, with the exception of the inner city, actually, which is also quite high. And then what we found is that a lot of these other indicators showed a similar pattern. So we looked at age of development. Now in Melbourne, the age of development goes down with this distance to inner city. So the inner city is the oldest, and the further away you go, the newer the developments become. Also, population density goes down. It's the densest in the city, where you have the CBD with all the skyscrapers, and then the further out you go, the bigger the houses and gardens of people become, and the less dense it is. Now, the house prices go down as well with the distance to the city center, because people like to live in the inner city. And education level actually also goes down the further away from the city center you go. And so does environmental awareness. Sense of community, so how much people collaborate with each other in clubs and in grassroots organizations, also goes down with the distance to city center. And so because we have all these relationships to the distance to city center that are the same as the relationship as green infrastructure has with the distance to city center, there is this relationship between the occurrence of green infrastructure and all these other indicators. So it's the correlation that we found was not intentional. Basically, it just occurred because of this phenomenon. Then what we did is we started talking to different people working at local governments in different cities in Melbourne. So Melbourne is divided in 38 like, let's say, districts, and each of them have their own local government. And we asked them, what are the main problems you are facing at the moment with the planning of green infrastructure? And what we found is that the biggest issues, there were 4 big issues that are on this slide here. So a big issue was collaboration, or the absence of collaboration, both within their organization and between organizations, like different councils, different local governments. The other one was the opportunistic nature of planning. What usually used to happen is that there was a little bit of a budget for green infrastructure, and they needed to do something with it before the end of the year. So they just looked, okay, where are we, for example, doing roadworks? Let's just put a rain garden there because this is the easiest way to go. Which means that they basically didn't consider any of the questions that I just have been posing. And they recognized this actually themselves. Oops. So there is an absence of local strategy. There is an absence of a strategy on a higher level where different councils work together, because the problem with these kind of issues is that they don't follow the normal political boundaries. Just like climate change, for example, it doesn't stop at the border. And this is the same for strategic planning. And then another problem that many people working in the local government had is that they couldn't justify or build a business case for the implementation of green infrastructure. So when they wanted to invest in a system, they needed to show their boss basically that it was beneficial, but it's very hard to capture the benefits of these green infrastructures in monetary terms. And so they had trouble finding the funding to build them. So the effect is actually that green infrastructure might look very nice sometimes, but it might not necessarily work. So this building that I showed you before in Sydney, I think it looks really great, but it is actually extremely unsustainable. So the idea behind these green facades is that it cools down the area, that it looks nice, and that it can even treat the water, so that you capture stormwater and you use it to water the plants. But what happened in Sydney is that it doesn't nearly rain enough to water these plants on a daily basis. And so what they do is they use tons and tons of drinking water to water these plants in order to keep them look like this. And drinking water in Sydney, unlike here in Quebec, is really, really scarce. So this is a very, very unsustainable practice. Yeah, and these the rooftop of my office building also has seen better days. It doesn't look particularly appealing at the moment. And the risk with implementing these kind of systems, especially green roofs, in places that are not wet enough, is that they start dying. A funny story that an urban planner at a city in Melbourne told me once is that she was in a city that was the rich area of Melbourne. It's actually where they record the Real Housewives of Melbourne, if you might know that show. The problem there that they had there is that people were very, very, very much against rain gardens in their streets. Reason being that they were taking away the parking and they had a lot of cars. So what they used to do, or what used to happen sometimes, is that people would deliberately park their car inside the rain garden to destroy it because they didn't want it and they wanted their parking back. So if you don't consider these things, this is what might happen, and you might end up with a rain garden that looks like this one, where it's completely clogged and not looking great at all. Yeah, this is another problem here with the same rain garden that I showed before, which is completely overgrown by algae. So the problem here is that there is too much pollution coming from the surrounding area flowing into this rain garden, and it can't deal with it. And so it's completely eutrophies and it starts looking like this and it starts smelling bad. Then another problem is the maintenance of these systems and littering. So if you implement these systems close to trees, for example, all the leaves at the end of, if you live in a country where you have the seasons, the trees will lose their leaves and they completely clog up the systems. They don't look good and they don't function well anymore. Another problem is if people don't know what they are or don't care what they are, they might put their trash in it, which you can also see in this picture a little bit. And obviously, this also makes it look less appealing and also harms the systems themselves. This is another picture from Natalie of a rain garden. This was actually a little urban wetland where they didn't consider the hydrological system well enough. They underestimated the amount of water that went through this wetland, and it completely eroded basically the system. This is an example from São Paulo in Brazil. A colleague of mine has worked there over the past years, and she was working with this big program where they are trying to have a linear park along a river all the way from the city center to the suburbs. It should be the longest linear park in the world, 75 kilometers, with riverbed reserves, with bike lanes, and it should be really cool like it looks here. But what it looks like in reality is this. Basically, they haven't done anything. And they have worked on it for 10 years. And the problem is that the problem was mostly that the objectives of the different people, stakeholders involved in this program were not aligning. So the different urban councils, district councils, they weren't talking to each other. They were having contrasting objectives. And so they were basically not working together in order to make this big project happen. So back to the differences between gray and green infrastructure. How do we basically answer the questions that I've been posing now? So what happens in the gray infrastructure is that we use hydrologic and hydraulic models and water quality models in order to calculate how big our sewers need to be, how big our treatment plants need to be, and how to maintain them. For these green systems, we can use planning support systems. So these are spatial models that help urban planners decide on spatial questions. And this is what I've done for my PhD. I've developed a PSS called SANTO, which stands for Spatial Suitability Analysis Tool. And it follows a process that I'm going to explain to you. It is being currently fully redeveloped. It used to be a plugin to a spatial software called ArcGIS. Some of you might know about. It's now fully being redeveloped as a standalone tool that you can just install on your computer. And this is being done by some students here at the Polytechnique, Christophe, Tristan, Frédéric, Louis, and Philippe. And they have so far created this interface that you can see here with the map of Montréal and all the functionality on the drop-down menus on the left. It hasn't been finished yet. We're still working on it at the moment. And I'm gonna explain you how it works. It uses a system called a multi-criteria decision analysis. And I bought 2 jars at the supermarket here yesterday, asking myself the question, what do I want to eat for breakfast? So I bought 1 jar, which is a nut spread of cashew nuts, and I brought another bottle or jar of jam, raspberry jam. And now I'm asking myself the question, well, which one do I actually want to eat for breakfast? So this is a decision problem. I have to choose between different options, the different jars. Now I need to ask myself the question, okay, well, how am I going to choose between them? They're very different. How can I compare jam with cashew nut butter? So I need to ask myself, well, what is important to me in this decision? So let's say I have 3 objectives. The first one being low cost. I don't want to spend money. The second one is good health. So I want to make sure that what I eat helps my my good health, and I don't want to harm it. And let's say I have some values when it comes to animal husbandry, and I want it to be vegan. All right, so these are the 3 objectives that I have for my decision problem. Now this refers back to the framework of suitability for green infrastructure that I showed you before. So these 3 objectives, when we think about green infrastructure building, we have a lot more than 3 objectives, but it comes down to the same principle. Okay, so let's start with low costs. We need to find a metric for low costs. So we use the purchasing price. It's a logical one. So I paid $7.99 for this cashew butter jar. I paid $2.49 for this raspberry jam. All right, so we have a way to measure the cost. Good health, how are we going to measure that? Well, these are the labels on these products. And let's say that we are going to measure good health by the amount of sugar that we find in these products. So if you, I don't know how well you can see, but the cashew butter on the left has 1 gram of sugar per 15 grams, which corresponds to 6.7% of sugar, whereas the jam has 10 grams per 15, which corresponds to 66.7% sugar. All right, so we measured sugar content. Vegan, the cashew butter is vegan. The jam is not. It contains gelatin, which is made of the bones of pigs, usually, I think. All right, so we have yes and no. All right, Now, this corresponds to the way that we can measure the different objectives that we had in our green infrastructure planning decision problem. So we had, for example, I showed you the map with slope, the map with flood extents here, and the map with vulnerability to heat. All right, so now we have different metrics, but how are we going to compare them? Because how do you compare the performance of $7.99 to not being vegan? I mean, you can't directly compare that. So we have to go through a step of translating these numbers into a metric that we can then cross-compare. So let's say $7.99 is quite expensive. So if we have to put that on a level between 0, where my objective of low cost is completely not reached, and 1 where my objective of low cost is fully reached, I would say it's quite low, closer to 0 than to 1. So I give it a value of 0.3. Now, $2.49 is pretty cheap. I'm sure I can find an even cheaper jam, but I would say the performance is quite good on low cost, so 0.8, close to 1. Now we do the same thing for the other two objectives, good health. Well, 6.7% sugar is quite low, so I give it 0.9, and 66.7 is obviously a lot of sugar. It's mostly sugar, so low performance, 0.2. Now 1 is vegan, so it fully performs on my objective of being vegan, so it gets 1. The other is not vegan, it fully not performs, it gets 0. All right, so now we've translated everything. This is what happens in Santo as well. So we have our, for example, slope map, and then we need to translate what does that mean for the implementation of a certain green system. And we create a map, a suitability map for slope, where we say, okay, 0, red is the lowest performing areas, green is the highest performing areas. Okay, the next step is we need to decide how important each of these 3 objectives are to us. Are they equally important, or are some more important than others? So let's say low cost is always quite important. Let's give it 0.3, about a third of the importance. Now, let's say I am a student, and the good health is not so important for me yet, because I don't notice any deterioration yet. So let's say 0.2. Then vegan, okay, I have very strong values. So let's say vegan is very important to me. I give it half of the importance, 0.5. This is what happens in Santo as well. So we have all the different criteria, and then we need to start comparing them to each other. How important are they? So for example, how important is having a low slope compared to high pollution removal? This is called the weighting step. Then what we do is we combine the performance of each of these alternatives with the importance for each objective. So we just multiply them basically, and then we sum them up to get the final result. So on a scale between 0, where it's the least favored option, to 1, where it's the most favored option, the cashew butter here gets 0.77, and the jam gets 0.28. So I can now conclude that, okay, the cashew butter for me is the right decision. Now, this is the same what happens in Santo. We combine all the different metrics together, we overlay them spatially, and we create our final suitability map. And here suitability is measured on the scale between 0 and 100. You can also measure it on the scale between 0 and 1, as I just showed you. So the red areas are not suitable, and the green areas are highly suitable for the implementation of a certain green infrastructure. So, okay, I'm coming close to the end. I'm just going to show you a few of the implementations we have done so far with Santo. So we have I've worked with the University of Exeter in the UK, where we did an analysis of a large province called Devon that you can see here on the map. On the left side, you can see the opportunities for the implementation of green infrastructure, in this case, wetlands. And on the right side, you can see the needs. So where do we need the wetlands? And so now we can actually start comparing, okay, so we can put them there, but we need them there. How are we gonna, combine these two? This is another case study in Melbourne. No, sorry, this is in Sydney. Where we looked, again, this is the same study that I showed you before, where we created these suitability maps as well, and then compared where are the current systems located compared to this spatial suitability. So there are many questions we need to consider when we think about the planning of green infrastructure, and many choices to make. And these questions need an answer. And I hope that I have convinced you at least somewhat in saying that the PSS, of course, there are more PSS than the one that I just showed you, that they can help us with answering some of these questions. So with that, I would like to finish. And I open the floor to questions. I think if anyone has a question, you can either. Okay, Christina, yes,
Okay.
Just open your mic and ask the question.
Okay, yes, thank you. Actually, first, do you hear me?
Sorry, yes, I can hear you.
Oh, excellent. So thank you for the presentation. My first question is slightly far from the subject. How do you finance all those travels?
How do I finance all the struggles?
Travels.
The travels. Well, I finance them, for example, at the moment with the European Union. So the fellowship that I've received from the European Union is a global fellowship, which allows me to collaborate with the partners here in Canada. So I am currently staying in Canada for a total of 1.5 years. And some of the other travels I just financed myself as well.
Okay, thank you.
Is there anything in the chat? No one.
Maybe I have a question or
Yeah.
comments. The examples shown at the beginning are very interesting, and they seem quite innovative at their scale. I'm wondering how they might work over the time. You talk about that a bit in your presentation, because since they are planned at municipal level or at land developer or commercial developer level also, but obviously they are also generated by the population, the residents themselves. We saw that with the balconies and or the green roof with the owner of the building.
Yeah.
How I would like to I'd like to know maybe a little bit more on that.
Yeah.
Dimension of infrastructure.
Yeah. So I don't know if it was audible for the audience, but the question is how do these infrastructures, how are they functioning over time with different, basically different stakeholders being involved in their maintenance? And this is actually it's a very important issue, and it's been identified, at least in Melbourne, where I'm aware of, that is actually the most important struggle at the moment with green infrastructure is maintenance. And I mean, in the case of Melbourne, they already have a legacy, so there is a lot of green infrastructure there. So they're kind of at that next step where maintenance becomes very apparent. And one of the big problems is that nobody wants to be responsible for the maintenance because it's a cost. So the park services don't see them as a park because they have enough parks to manage, but the sewer services don't see them as a sewer because they have their other stuff to do. And so it's actually super important that when you build these systems that you already have a maintenance plan where the costs are covered, because this is where it often goes wrong. So that's a very good point. And I think this is also where community can come in. If you implement it with the community and in a receptive community, they will take responsibility for them because they care about them. And so they A, will not pollute them or break them, but B, they might even be involved in the maintenance of them. So I think that social aspect is very important as well. Now,
Je peux poser une autre question. C'est maybe something that was not so clear in the presentation, but I know you do it, like the weighing of the different factors. How do you involve many stakeholders who have different opinions and would weigh differently the different opportunities or needs?
Yeah. So the question for the online audience is, where in the weighting step, how do you involve different stakeholders in the weighting? How do you consider the different opinions in the process? And so how we do it is that, well, there's different ways of doing it. I think important is when you do these kind of urban planning exercises that you involve all the relevant stakeholders. So this can be done through workshops, for example, planning workshops, where both the decision makers, but also the people affected by the decision are present. And then you go through a process of elicitation of their preferences. So you ask them in different ways what their preferences are. So you can use you can use panel discussions to come to sort of like a consensus so that everyone is on the same page, but you can also ask people individually, what is your preference, through surveys, through different types of, there are online tools in order to elicit preferences from people. And then you can combine these preferences later on or contrast them to start a discussion about the differences between different stakeholders. So I think this is one of the, probably one of the most important strengths of PSS is that they foster that kind of collaboration where you make explicit the differences, but also the commonalities between people and how that affects the planning or decision problem and solutions. The lights go off here, so I guess that may be a sign. Any other online questions?
I have one more question to finish. Yeah. So to which city have you been adapting Santo, and to which city do you plan on adapting Santo in Quebec?
Yes, thank you. So the question is, where have I so far applied or adapted Santo, and where am I planning to do it in the future in Quebec? So I've obviously done it in Melbourne where I built it, and I've applied it in Sydney. We have been working with Sandrine Lacroix, the PhD student, together with Françoise and Danielle on the implementation of Santo in Trois-Rivières, which is a small city between Montreal and Quebec City. And the plans are to apply it also in Montreal into the future, which we are gonna probably do over the next couple of years, working together with a lot of stakeholders here in Montreal. And then I'm also planning to implement it in Zurich, the other place where I live. Devon, I showed you Devon, so it's been implemented there as well. Yeah, I mean, I'm very open to new case studies always, of course, to keep improving the tool and keep implementing more and more objectives into it so that it is going to be more relevant in different contexts. So yeah, there's lots of work to do.
So I think we can close the conference. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'll close the conference. Thanks everyone online for coming, and I wish you a nice day.